Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank all my Indian friends, especially Professor Shah, that is a very, he's a very young man, but a very old friend. And all the other friends from Nagpur. I was very intrigued by the various things which were said yesterday, and I will give a talk about Milano, which is my hometown. I tend to believe that each of us effectively knows and can work only in one town, we as architects, in spite of all the movements and the traveling we do. So my talk is about Milano, and I have tried to understand how the information society, which is one of the aspects of this convention of these 2 days, has actually affected my own city. So I have collected material on this specific subject. So there is the first part of my presentation where I will read the text, and then we will go through the images. But I think it's important to distinguish between the words which architects say and the images which we show, because sometimes we are really sort of so attracted by the beauty of images that we architects no longer listen to the words, which in fact are rather important. So I will now read my introduction text. Where are we at with the dichotomy between international and regional? Are we sure that countries such as the United States are still architecture leaders, even if there is no architectural magazine left over there? Are we confident that anything related to local culture, tradition, and low energy consumption is implicitly truer and better? How does the new political economic map of the world following the end of the first, second, third world division reflects in a map of architecture and urbanism? Is there a place where new architecture and city ideas tend to be generated and then spread out from? These are just my personal impulsive questions. What books should we buy today to learn and copy from? Does an information city really exist? This is maybe the most important question. Let me now tell you the rules of my game. Unlike artists, writers, and managers, the work of architects is much slower and has a slow digestion. Most architects today get to know and to work only in one place or context. Globalization, with regard to architecture, to me seems a virtual fabrication. My place, whether I like it or not, is Milano, in Italy, the city where I lived in most of my life, where I work, and for which I get emotional. I wrote 2 books on Milano, a third is underway. In this lecture, I have used only images of Milano which I produced myself. This, for me, is very important. The fact that I haven't borrowed images from someone else's work. So the source is myself, and which I hope these images illustrate well the arguments. Cultural contexts are, as the title of this meeting in Nagpur says, effectively ever-changing. The climate of the earth is changing, economy seems to be changing every 20 minutes, and societies seem to change and pretend to be madly dynamic. I think sometimes this is an illusion, in fact. Our perceptions and mood change. I was rather taken aback recently when I heard some young American girls who defined Milano, which is a dense European 19th century city, as most cities in the world effectively are, through the criteria of American cities. To their eyes, Milano was an old town, and the abandoned Expo area, 2 years ago Milano hosted the Expo, was considered the central business district. But movements, changes, updates, novelties, and breakthroughs are rare in architecture. A friend of mine once said that architecture is a bit like an elephant, a comment which came back to me when I had to prepare this lecture in India, because I think you know what elephants are. I sincerely believe there is no such thing as a physical information city, because information and communication, and this is a peculiarity worth noting, are physicity-less. And that's why I called my lecture Information and Physicality. It could have been called Information versus Physicality. Every city, of course, bore and bears relationship to the economics, the politics, and the reality of a specific moment in time. But not every aspect of economics and politics and society produces a tangible effect on our physical world. For example, in the 19th century, trade infrastructures changed the face of cities, and shopping centers have done something similar in the 20th century. Yet, television, low birth rate, and internet seem not to leave traces on our urban conglomerations. Yet, as Castells, the Spanish sociologist, says, the information society generates information cities. But these seem to be of no physical or architectural relevance. They are, to me, invisible. Lots of us architects are embarrassed and ashamed by the poverty, mediocrity, injustice, bad taste. I know that talking about taste is a difficult subject, but I think that bad taste, honestly, is very diffused. Bad taste and disattention towards architecture and the city we're all part in. On one hand, we're ready as architects to take part of the blame. But we should also know that cities are really collective efforts. I agree only in part with those colleagues who believe that today's cities are unfortunate fatalities. I tend to believe that we have the cities we want, and in a way we deserve. Neoliberalism has its laws, its rules, its costs, its diabolical architects, its pros and cons. If the majority of us want to live in a low-density neighborhood and like to pretend we live in the countryside, then we should by default expect to be car-dependent. All 20th century urban utopias have praised the car as a symbol of freedom and joy, and now that's what we have. I think it is remarkable how frequently utopias of architecture have turned into something realistic, almost into banality. This, of course, has taken about 100 years. So I have images for you. Under each of these images, there are captions. I will not read the captions, but I will say something on top of the text which appears. These are images I took from one of the book of Castells, and I used it to sum up the basic concept. The basic concept is a comparison between a 19th century city and a 20th century city. As you can see, the prime change is the size of the urban blocks. So the size of the urban blocks on the left is Barcelona, which is one of the canonic examples of the exponential and extremely fast 19th century growth of cities, much faster than anything we have seen probably over the last 30 years. Maybe only some Chinese cities could be comparable. So you have small blocks, comparatively small blocks, a dense street pattern, and a permeability which is diffused. On the right-hand side, again, it's a comparison which Castells make. You have Irvine in California, where the blocks are much bigger, the permeability is far less, and there are lots of dead ends. And this shows the application of the Castell's comparison as applied to Milan. So you can see really how easy it is to find a similarity also in a city like Milan. So on the left, you have expansion areas of a semi-central area in Milan with courtyard blocks, exactly the same size of the Barcelona example. And on the right side, you have, again in Milano, a further outside area where you have industries, you have bigger blocks, and you have dead-end streets. So we seem to have the possibility that in the same cities you have different context. So I think that is one aspect worth reminding, because in a town like Milano, and this is what I will explain, the size of the city justifies the presence of many sub-cities within it. The growth of Milano has been largely a 19th century growth and a 20th century growth. There is a clear center, a very clear to the point that there is one square in the center which has to be accepted as the place of power, where you have the church, where you have the municipality, where you have culture, and where you have economics all coming together. The city had for centuries its wall. Its wall has disappeared, like in most European cities, and then the city has grown continuously, not only until the 1940s, when the last map is on the bottom right-hand side, but it has grown well over, and it has become a metropolis. The relationship of a city to the new economic situation has always been a conflictual relationship. In Milano, you can see very clear that the concept of paradox and paradigm have coexisted. It's not as if one came first and the other one came later. There's always been an overlap. And so it's very hard to say what is looking at the future and what is looking at the past. In fact, the whole history of 20th century architecture is a history which is full of second thoughts and doubts and rethinking. This, for example, of course, it's a difficult concept which I'm trying to put across, and it would in itself justify a lot of talk and I would need to demonstrate it. But I have tried to sort of choose some iconic images which try and show you what I mean. These are two buildings in Milano which were built in exactly the same year. I will tell you who the architects are, but I would like you to look at these buildings as if they were anonymous, as if they belong to a kind of vernacular about Milano. So on the left-hand side, you have a building by Terragni. Terragni was a fascist architect, and so was Muzio, who's the architect on the right-hand side. They were both fascists during the fascist regime. The fascist regime in Italy lasted for about 30 years, from the 1920s until the end of the First World War, until 1944. And it had very clear ideas about how architecture could represent the power of fascism. So there were both fascist architects. One is Terragni on the left, one is Muzio on the right. But they're both residential buildings, and they're both urban blocks. So they both face the street, but they are completely different. One is about structure, so one we could say is Corbusian in a way. The other one on the right-hand side is made of walls. And this is very evident, and it's very strongly kind of put forward. And this is in exactly the same year, in 1933. So this was the reaction of Italian architecture to the transformations of Italy under a dictatorship political regime. These two buildings, which are very well known in Milano and which were widely published throughout the late 50s and early 60s, and they were very important symbolically because Italy in the 50s and 60s went through a very fast economic growth. Italy had exponential figures of growth in the 1950s and 1960s. These are two skyscrapers, and they are practically the first skyscrapers which got built in Milano. So they were clearly expression of an economic transformation. But you can see how the visual references were completely different. The one by Gio Ponti on the left-hand side used an aesthetic which is sort of streamlined and which today we could call dynamic. It could look like a Guzzar did building, but it isn't. The other one on the right is the Torre Velasca, and it is a skyscraper lower than the Pirelli skyscraper, but which is full of historical references and analogies. So it's not streamlined, it uses the wall, it's a skyscraper made with a wall, and it has the shape of a medieval tower like you would find in many Italian towns. So again, is there an architecture of the Italian economic boom of the 1950s? This is the question. Again, another question happens in the 1980s. These are both projects which were built in the 1980s, which show that there were different possibilities. One is a dense housing block, and one is single-family houses, row houses. So which is the architecture which really represents Italy in the 1980s? This is a question. Is it palazzos with apartment blocks, or is it individual family houses? I don't think that we have to make a decision. What is important to me is that we understand that the way architecture reacts to economic changes is always diverse and heterogeneous. Next, I have made specific photos showing what Milano is like today. Of course, most of us and many of my colleagues, speakers of the last couple of days, know Milano because it is very attractive as a town. It's not like Rome, it's not like Florence, it's not like Venice. It has tourism, but it also has business. Many people of us know Milano because of the Expo of 2 years ago, or because it is a fashion capital. So lots of people think of Milano as being the fashion capital. So I've reported, I've made these photographs, and these 10 points show you where I did the photographs, to explain what are the complications of the present situation of Milano, and that we as architects have to make choices. We have to say A or B, so it's a bit like alternatives. I don't think that I'm presenting you with one thing which is good and one thing which is bad, but it forces us as architects to make decisions. So I've called these next group of images, I call them dilemmas, because these are dilemmas which we have to confront ourselves with. One is really a novelty in our cities, in our European cities. Maybe in this part of the world it's not something which you perceive so strongly, which is emptiness. Inside the metropolitan area, you have large empty areas. So the question is really whether a metropolis has empty areas and what it does with it, and how these can be integrated and used. So on the left-hand side, you have an abandoned industrial area. Here you had one of the largest steelworks in Europe, which got abandoned about 20 years ago, when there was the general steel crisis in the 1990s, and which is just now beginning to be decontaminated from all the ground pollution there is. So it's an enormous area, and it's right in the middle of the metropolis. So how do we comply with this, and how do we address this subject? The risk of these large empty areas is that they become logistic hubs. If we don't want this to happen, we have to propose things, and the propositions which we make have to be propositions which work regardless whether the economy is growing or it's declining. I think we as architects know how to handle, in Europe, we know how to handle growth, because we've developed in the last 200 years or so devices and rules to manage growth, but we haven't yet learned on how to manage decline. And as architects, we should be courageous enough and probably creative enough to consider decline as a possibility. And we shouldn't exclude it from our future scenarios. Another dilemma, dilemma number 2, is the dilemma of streets. I think it's a fundamental subject that we should see that streets have disappeared practically completely from the architectural urban design strategy. So streets are today considered just functional artifacts and not as social artifacts. Is this something we really want, or isn't it? Here you have two streets in Milan. On the left-hand side, you have a typical street, which is only functional. And on the right-hand side, you have a street. This is designed by one of the sort of father figures of Italian architecture, Vittorio Gregotti. So it is a street. It is a street physically. There are no shops. So it's not as if it's a perfect street, but there is the idea that buildings should follow a general urban rule, which is accepted by all architects working on that street front. Another dilemma which we have to confront is the one of pedestrianization. Here I have a comparison between an arcade which is in the center of Milano, which is an arcade which is public space. It is public space not only in terms of use, because also the one on the right is a public space in terms of use, but it's a public space in terms of property. So it's owned by the city under a private building. So it's like the belly of this building, and it's private. It's public and private together. It's a joint venture. On the right-hand side, you have a shopping center. It's a shopping center designed by a well-known Milan architect, a specially designer called Michele De Lucchi, who is now the chief editor of the magazine Domus. But it is a private public space. And for me, the idea of ownership is fundamental in this respect. So how do we handle the theme of pedestrianization and public space? Another problem which all metropolitan areas have in this age of information and of metropolitan growth is transport. Transport, I must say, is a bit of an obsession, because it's not quite clear to me how much transport we want. For example, yesterday, just to comment on the speech given by our friend and colleague working for the Zaadid office, I must say that when I saw those images of Oxford Circus without buses and turned into a pedestrian area, I felt rather depressed as a result. I think at the moment, Oxford Circus is congested. I think most of us know what we're talking about. We're talking of one of the most congested spots in London. But seeing it empty with 3 people dressed by Armani and pulling a trolley is much worse than the present situation. So we have to look for cities which are rich, which are congested, but which are not over-congested. So this is a crossroad in Milano, and what happens underneath the same crossroad. So it is the same place, just looked at on two different levels. So having an idea about how transport can be managed is something to me quite significant. Another dilemma, and this is, I think it's the last dilemma I have, is the idea of comfort. It's very nice to be in a hotel which has both a shower and a bathtub, where I can regulate the air conditioning, where I get a good view of Nagpur. But I think that comfort can have also some side effects. I think that we have, for example, to decide if we prefer comfort inside our house and our apartments, or if we prefer comfort in the public domain. And I think that having both can be slightly too much. And so here you have a photograph of a very, posh vitrine in the center of Milano, where you also have a fireplace, a false fireplace, and where you have expensive sofas. And then you have an image of a new public space, which is in front of a train station in Milano, where you have public comfort. So asking ourselves how far we can go with comfort, and how much we really need, and whether we can be simple and comfortable at the same time, and if comfort is really, it's not becoming a sort of paranoia in a way. I also tend to believe that we don't know our cities. I have this impression, and I keep telling myself that I don't know my own city well enough. And so there was a moment a few years ago when I really decided that the only way to get to know my city was to do long walks through it. And here you have a map which you can mentally compare to the maps we saw earlier, where you see how big Milan it has become. What you see in the center is actually, in the middle is actually the center of Milano. And what you see in the north is the metropolitan area, where most of the industries are located. This is the second largest industrial area in Europe. And on the south, you see the Parco Agricolo Sud, which is a large agricultural park. So I think, first of all, it's interesting to see this combination between a city center, its industries and its agriculture, all working together. I think this is not really intentional, but it's the way things turned out to be. And so these walks have helped me to understand my own city. I have some tips, which, being the audience mostly composed by students, my personal tips to them. And the first tip is to collect and read texts about your city. And this is maybe easier said than done in cities like India, or like most of the world outside one part of Europe, where urban culture is very different from what it is in Europe. But I think that getting to know one's cities is a complex and effort which takes many years. So I think that each of us should have books and maybe make books. And making books is very amusing, and it's really like making an architectural project. The second tip is making experiences about your city. So this, for example, is a photograph taken during one of my walks. Believe it or not, this is in the middle of the metropolitan area. This was an abandoned industrial area which became so abandoned, and the abandonment went on for so long, that in the end it became a park by itself, just because trees, look after themselves and they grow here and there. So where you don't see trees, it means that the land is so polluted that trees won't grow, but you have grass instead. And after about 30 years, the terrain sort of, in a way, cleans itself up. So making direct experiences about one city is very, very important. These two aspects, the one of the academic act of reading and the one of making experiences, is in a way a self-portrait of myself, but it's a sort of self-portrait which I would like to transfer to you. I can see that I'm over time, so my recommendation is to make maps. I think making maps of your city can be great fun, and it is a form not only of documentation, but it is also a form of knowledge. And the map is really like a project. So I have 3 recommendations, which will only take about a minute to read. Architects must work actively at bringing the city back under their domain and make an effort to enter in direct dialogue with planners, sociologists, and economists. This is what I would call their political responsibility. Second, architects must accept that their role is not solely related to applying building techniques and real estate equations. Quality is not equivalent to technology. This is what I would call their cultural responsibility. Architects must face the fact that they are responsible for what they do. Excuses such as time pressure, financial volatility, off-the-shelf design should no longer be accepted. Too often I have met nice colleagues who claim their work is not really their work. This is what I would call their ethical responsibility. Thank you very much. Thank you.